Good evening. Good evening. Welcome. I am Josh Barber. I am the EPA project manager for the Havertown PCP Superfund site. And tonight we're going to talk about some upcoming plans, and we're in the middle of a public comment period for some of the work that's been ongoing with the site. Tonight we are recording this video so that it can be posted eventually to the Haverford Township website or YouTube channel, and that way we'll have a record of it as well. Right, and so that will be linked to, we'll have a link to that on our EPA page. So I'm going to do some introductions in a moment, but if you do next slide, please. So tonight we have three main objectives that I want to achieve. The first is that I want to provide an update on the Havertown PCP site. It's been a while since we've had a meeting like this. The site is very old. We've been working on it for a long time, and there's a lot of recent developments. So we want to provide an update. As I mentioned, we're in the middle of a public comment period, a 30-day public comment period on a document that we put out. That comment period runs through March 15th, and it's for a document that we call an engineering evaluation cost analysis. It's an ECA for short. I'm going to try to minimize the use of the acronyms. We all have our own professional jargon that we use, and I'll try to keep it to a minimum. But ECA is what you will hear me say many times tonight, and that stands for an engineering evaluation cost analysis. I'll explain what that is, why it's out for public comment, and what it means going forward for the site. And there's a couple different times where I will stop my rambling, take a breath, and we'll do question and answer for anything that's on your mind, whether it's related to the ECA, the site, or any other concerns that are potentially relevant to the Superfund site in general. Next slide, please. This is the overall agenda for tonight. We're going to do introductions in a moment, and I will discuss. I hate waiting for the big reveal at the end of a presentation, so I'm going to get right to it. I like to be held in suspense in my suspenseful movies and things like that, but not my government presentations. So we'll get right to that, and then we'll explain what that means. I'm going to provide a really brief overview of Superfund, the program in general, because it's not something necessarily that everybody in the public is familiar with, and we want to make sure that that familiarity is there because we need a foundation for all the things we'll be discussing. I will also go over the far distant past about this Superfund site as well as the more recent history. We'll take a break after that. That will actually be about halfway, somewhere between 20 to 30 minutes. So please bear with me. And then we'll have plenty of time for question and answer. And then after that, we'll get into more of the meat of the ECA itself, the reasons why it exists, so on and so forth. And then we'll have time for additional questions, discussion. Thank you. Since we have such a small audience now, are there any initial questions about like administrative questions or, anything like that? All right, good. Okay. So there's a big group of individuals that work with me on this site. As I said, I'm the project manager for EPA, which is one of the defined roles in Superfund law for oversight of a Superfund site. But I also have with me Angela Ithier here, who is the Community Involvement Coordinator. Every Superfund site has a Community Involvement Coordinator. We also have a different part of Superfund that works with my side called the Removal Program. And there's an on-scene coordinator involved with the Removal Program who's named Eduardo Rivera. His picture is up there, but he's not with us tonight. Bob Stank is my co-project manager for the site. He'll be getting more and more involved as we're getting into our construction phase. From the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, Colin Wade is my counterpart. He's sitting over here. So we work together to collaborate on the site work. And then Superfund, we are very consultant and contractor heavy for a lot of the technical expertise and the construction work that we do. And our design and our oversight contractor is Tetra Tech. And we have several folks here tonight from Tetra Tech as well. Harish Mittal, who is not here, is pictured there. He is my counterpart, my project lead with Tetra Tech. Ron Wernicki also is not here, but he's pictured there. He is our construction coordinator. And then Shelley McCoy, who is sitting over here, is our geotechnical engineer with Tetra Tech. And Liz Piazza is our civil engineer. So a lot of the work that we'll be talking about, whether it comes to the groundwater contamination that we're going to discuss, the designs for the treatment plant. Shelley, Liz, and the other folks from Tetra Tech have been very heavily involved in that. All right, so the ECA, again, the Engineering Evaluation Cost Analysis. This is something that, well, I'm going to explain how the site is organized from an administrative standpoint, but what I wanted to make clear is that the ECA pertains to what we call the deep groundwater part of the site. I'll explain what deep groundwater means. I promise I won't keep saying I'm going to get to that, I'm going to get to that, but just for now know that we refer to the deeper groundwater at the Havertown PCP site as Operable Unit 3, or OU3. The ECA is there to evaluate a limited number of options for how we treat the groundwater that's being collected from all of our different recovery points. You're going to say, well, why are you evaluating an option now for that? So originally, there was an older treatment plant that was present at the site that was operating for nearly 2 decades. And as I'll discuss, that plant had to be demolished. And currently, if you drive by our location at 900 North Eagle Road, we have a temporary treatment system that is set up. And we're not winning any beauty contests with this temporary treatment facility that's out there now. It's very functional in the short term, but we have to evaluate a long-term option to address our contaminated groundwater that is still being pumped from various locations throughout the site. And this ECA is recommending that we build a new, brand spanking new groundwater treatment plant with at least 175 gallons of treatment capacity per minute. The old plant had about 55 to 65, and the current temporary facility has about 100. We also, for reasons that I will go into, are proposing to install up to 8 additional groundwater recovery wells throughout the area to address some new contamination that we discovered deeper. This is not contamination that anybody is potentially being exposed to because it's very deep in the bedrock, and there is no groundwater pumping that's being done in this area except by us to remove the contamination and treat it. A few things about Superfund. So Superfund, better known as the acronym CERCLA, which is the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, has several key points that make it unique. Superfund is broken down. We have 3 main ways in which we can perform Superfund's goal, which is to clean up abandoned hazardous waste sites. We have the remedial program, which is what I work under. And if you're going to think of remedial, it's not that I'm still learning, although I am. I'm not in remedial remediation. We are the longer term cleanup. We are typically the more complex, larger, more expensive cleanups. We also have a program under removal under Superfund that's referred to as removal. Removal and remedial work together a lot. That's happening a lot at the Havertown site. And the removal you can think of as either dealing with emergency situations or more shorter term acute spills or releases or newly discovered potential threats to human health and the environment. And then there's another part of Superfund that we call enforcement. And what it really boils down to is Superfund has a goal of making the polluters pay their responsible portion for the work that's done. And that can be through responsible parties performing removal actions and or remedial actions, or paying EPA back for the costs for the federal tax dollars that we expend in order to perform the work at the site. And so under enforcement, we use the evidence that we gather where possible to have the responsible parties conduct the investigation and cleanup work. The Superfund is called the Superfund because it collects a tax on the oil and gas and on the chemical and certain parts of the oil and gas industry. Those taxes go into a fund that help to fund the investigation and cleanup work for sites where there is no responsible owner or the responsible party or parties are not solvent enough to perform all of the work. The Superfund was allowed, the tax expired in the early 2000s, and that was just reauthorized under the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed. So now that tax is actually just starting to kick in this year in 2022. And one of the other things that Superfund does is it establishes a list of Superfund sites, or a process upon which you can have a site be added to a list. It's called the National Priorities List, and that's essentially when a site becomes an official Superfund site, is when it goes through the process to be added to the National Priorities List, or the NPL. One other slide on Superfund here. And I will say that this large vessel that's hanging from this excavator, we're going to talk about this. This is actually a new component that was recently installed on site for one of our, it's our new main groundwater collection hub for a part of the neighborhood. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I just wanted to give that a nod. Superfund is unique in that it specifically requires and encourages community involvement, community engagement. Things like tonight's public meeting, the public comment period, are specifically called out in the Superfund law for very clear and obvious reasons, because Superfund sites are very tangible and noticeable things that are clearly, directly, or potentially affecting any community where they're located. States and tribes are also highly encouraged to participate or required to participate where possible in all of our work. When it comes to the work that we're doing, some of it is cutting edge, especially as we're moving further and further along in attempting to treat the contamination while it's still in the ground. Superfund really pushes the boundaries and working with academia and our Office of Research and Development to develop new approaches for addressing contamination. And we have a unique facet in that not only do we have to follow the Superfund law and the Superfund process, but we specifically have to take into account other federal, state, or local laws that are applicable to the work that we want to do. And I'll use a weird-sounding acronym later called an ARAR. And the ARAR really, when you hear ARAR, it really means other federal, state, and local laws besides the Superfund law. And we'll talk about what that means. But that is a unique requirement of CERCLA that we must take into account those other regulatory components that apply to the site. All right, now, I want to talk a little bit about the site history of the Havertown PCP Superfund site, and this slide really pertains to before it became the Superfund site. Now, I wasn't around, so I am not speaking from firsthand knowledge here. I was 3 years old when this site was added to the national priorities list. So please bear with me. If anybody else in the room knows more about this history, I love talking about this stuff because I always learn more and more about the things that we don't know, or that at least I don't know, because not everything makes it into the records that we have, and I certainly can't read every word in every record that we have. So the Havertown site is a result of the National Wood Preservers operations that occurred on this property, currently where Mr. Storage, Swiss Farms, Tony Roney's, that area in there is where National Wood Preservers was located. This photo is actually after the tanks that were used at National Wood Preservers, the tanks of treatment fluids had been removed. That is what this photo is showing us now, this aerial photo. You can still see the Lobs Lumber building in the lower left-hand corner there that was adjacent to the wood treatment facility. National Wood Preservers used different chemicals to treat wood, either through pressure treatment, like typical pressure-treated wood, only not with the chemicals that we use nowadays, or there was a dip process that was used to dip timbers for things like railroad ties or other pressure-treated wood needs. And then that wood was allowed to sit and dry on the property before being put out for sale. The main preservative, the main protectant, was a chemical called pentachlorophenol, PCP. It's not the drug, but it's the same acronym, pentachlorophenol. That's our main bad actor here. It's the main contaminant that we deal with, but there's many other contaminants that are associated along with the PCP. And the PCP was mixed with petroleum products or typically diesel fluid, or diesel fuel, or mineral spirits for several decades. Eventually, that process changed over to using metal salts, such as chromated copper arsenate later on. But the main operation that really impacts what we see and what we're dealing with was this process that involved pentachlorophenol. So at the site, we have a wide range of contaminants of concern. But our main issue, I would say our main indicator contaminant that we look at is the PCP. Dioxins and furans are listed at the bottom of this. And they're not as prevalent as the PCP when it comes to making up the overall mass of the concentration of the contamination that's in the groundwater, but they're also they have a very high toxicity level as well, so much lower concentrations of dioxins and furans can also prevent or present unacceptable risk. We do have other petroleum-based compounds such as benzene, ethylbenzene, toluene, and xylene, and some other heavier hydrocarbons as well that we refer to as polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. All that you really need to know out of this is that PCP is the primary contaminant we're going to be discussing tonight, but our treatment process treats all of the contaminants of concern in our treatment plant. Next slide, please. As I mentioned a few moments ago, we have organized the site into different components. This is really an administrative breakdown. It typically happens at all Superfund sites, where you want to break the site down into pieces so that you can more quickly manage different parts of the site through the process. And what's shown here on the right in the map, what I want to really highlight with this is two things. The big purplish, pinkish blob that's in the middle, that represents the overall footprint of the known extent of groundwater contamination. This is not to say that the groundwater contamination in every depth is the same within this area, but this is something that we're going to discuss in a little more detail. And just for reference, if you could highlight Eagle Road, which is running essentially right here, right? And then Lawrence Road is running across this way. So just to kind of reference, and then this area that is shown on the left, the yellow line, that represents our cap that sits over the former National Wood Preserver property. And what's on top of that right now is the Mr. Storage facility, some of the other industrial businesses that are to the left or to the west of that, just trying to orient everybody on that. So the site is broken down into 3 different OUs, operable units. OU1 deals with the wood preserver site itself and the soil contamination that was there. There's a synthetic or a plastic cap that sits on top of that, and then there's soil and other fill material that's been placed on top of it. There was drummed waste that was removed from that site back in the 80s and 90s. And we also, there's a storm sewer that runs from Lawrence Road down behind Rittenhouse Circle and discharges into Naylor's Run. And the lower section of that storm sewer, it's a 36-inch concrete pipe storm sewer that was leaking contamination into Naylor's Run because the contaminated groundwater was getting into that storm sewer through cracks in the pipe. That lower part of that pipe was sealed as part of our work with OU1. The other part of the sites that we have is OU2 and OU3, which both pertain to groundwater. OU2 deals with the shallow groundwater, which is really the top, like from ground surface down to about 30 feet deep, which right about there is where you start going from overburden material like sand, gravel, everything that's not rock, until down to the bedrock interface. The bedrock surface is give or take around 20 to 30 feet in this area. And then the deeper groundwater, which is OU3, and that's what the ECA falls under, deals with the deeper groundwater, which extends from 30 to 100 feet below ground surface. That also pertains to a secondary source area that was created because of there was an old sewer line, sanitary sewer, that ran from the former Philadelphia chewing gum factory, which is where the YMCA is now. That sewer line conveyed contaminated groundwater through a pipe that had been forgotten, and it was discharging into an area that's called recreation open space owned by the township east of Rittenhouse Circle, back near Naylor's Run. It's a small area that we addressed under our last cleanup for OU3 as well. So we call that the ROS area. And we have a map of that in a little bit. Next slide, please. So I'm almost done with the site background. We can stop for questions. One other thing that's important to know is that the federal government owns a couple pieces of property that house our infrastructure for the site. The former Lobbs Lumber property is the large rectangular piece up here, and this is approximate boundaries. You can see the Mr. Storage directly to the south, and this aerial actually is of our current temporary facility where the permanent treatment plant used to be and the new treatment plant will go. But this is property that we own. The Army Corps of Engineers is actually the holding entity for that parcel, as well as there is a there's a piece of residential property that was subdivided, that triangular piece of property that is east of the parking lot for the YMCA, which was subdivided and purchased by the Army Corps of Engineers for EPA in order to implement our initial response action for groundwater under OU2. There is a 20-foot deep trench, a subsurface trench filled with rock and pipe that collects groundwater at that point and pumps that water back up to our treatment facility for treatment. That's a prime area that is capturing a lot of our shallower groundwater contamination. But when I talk about the CTR area, that's when I'm talking about that little triangle. CTR stands for collection trench. And then the other area, the treatment plant property or the Lobs lumber property, is the larger property. Next slide, please. So there is a lot of work that EPA and DEP have done over the decades at this site. One thing that I did not put in this presentation is that this site, I mentioned this, but this site was listed on the NPL in 1982. So we're going on 4 decades of various response work at this site. And we've made a lot of progress, but there's additional work to do, which we're discussing tonight. And what this slide is meant to just kind of highlight some of those different activities that we've done. Very early on in 1988, EPA installed a catch basin right near where that storm sewer pipe was discharging, just east of the parking lot for the YMCA, where Naylor's Run kind of opens up to the air. There was oil that was seeping out there, and so a catch basin was put in to capture that oil. A little bit later, under Operable Unit 1, an oil water separator was installed there. The footings for that oil water separator are still visible along the creek side, and that allowed us to capture the actual oil, which we refer to as free product. The free product that had not been dissolved yet, that was captured under the oil water separator and containerized and then shipped off-site for disposal. Under OU1, we had removed all of the tanks. There was 9 large, tall tanks that held all the treatment liquids that were used for the wood treatment process. Those were removed. And as I mentioned previously, we had, after the whole National Wood Preservers facility had been demolished and removed, there was because of the high concentrations of contamination in soil, there was a synthetic liner placed on top of that surface, and then several feet of clean soil that were placed on top of that. We refer to that as our cap. Operable Unit 2, that was our interim. It was not our final groundwater cleanup. It was our first real attempt at addressing the groundwater contamination. That involved a remedy that was implemented starting in the early 90s, where a smaller groundwater treatment plant was constructed, 2 groundwater recovery wells. Think of like a production well. If you ever had a production well, if you grew up on well water or you have well water, you know somebody has well water, it's that kind of well. Produces water out of a boring that goes down into the ground that has a casing that keeps it open. Those groundwater recovery wells were along Eagle Road, between the YMCA and Eagle Road. Not a lot of space there, actually one on either side of the road. And we also had that groundwater collection trench that was installed in the CTR area, east of the YMCA property. There was also the storm sewer repair that I mentioned previously. And then under OU3, that was our final groundwater cleanup. And that was meant to be the final solution for the groundwater contamination. We expanded the treatment plant, so we upgraded our capacity from around 40 gallons per minute of treatment up to 55 to 65 gallons per minute. There was 4 new groundwater recovery wells that were installed, 3 in that recreation open space area, and 1 more along Eagle Road. And the trench was installed there. And actually, for some reason, I had the storm sewer repair. I'm sorry. I was looking at the second to last column on the right. So the 4 recovery wells were installed. There was also some injection wells that we installed in the cap, where we wanted to take the groundwater that we were treating and inject it into the area of high concentration soil contamination to try and flush it out so that we could further extract that contamination that might be trapped under that liner. And then we had the ROS area east of Rittenhouse Circle, where we removed soil contamination because the oil, the free product that had traveled down the sewer line, this abandoned sanitary sewer, was literally high concentration material that had just come up out of a pipe, straight up out of the ground, and essentially created a secondary area of high concentration soil contamination, and that was removed. So, next slide, please. All right. I am not going to discuss every bullet, every sentence on the slide, but what I want to show here, really this is the genesis for why we are here tonight to talk about the ECA. Why did we have to demolish the treatment plant that was previously there? It all started in 2018, which, if you remember, we had a record year's worth of precipitation. The water table had become elevated in this area and in other parts of the Commonwealth, other parts of the Mid-Atlantic, and the result of that rise in water table had resulted in the shallow groundwater contamination in areas east of the YMCA, along on the Rittenhouse Circle area, actually coming up out of the ground surface and seeping out into soil, into grassy areas on one or more residential yards. We had a report of a sheen in someone's driveway, as well as they also had additional high flows of water into their crawl space beneath their house. Their sump was running constantly. And so myself and Colin actually responded to this complaint in early 2019. And to make a long story short, we conducted sampling, a couple different rounds, and we found that multiple residential properties had concentrations of contaminants either in the soil or the water that was seeping up out of the soil or the water that was in their sumps in their basement. And sometimes a combination of those were above not only our cleanup standards, but they were present at levels that could present a potential short-term health threat to people if they were it would be a pretty extreme situation, but if people were drinking that water or using a lot and getting it on their hands through direct contact regularly, frequently, and we did have individuals who were trying to make sure that their sump pumps didn't stop working, otherwise their crawl spaces were going to fill up with water. So as a result of these findings, we initiated, if you remember earlier, I talked about different parts of Superfund. There's remedial and removal. So I approached Eduardo Rivera, who's the on-scene coordinator for this job, and we initiated a time-critical removal in 2019 that started in 2020. We selected our cleanup approach in 2019. We mobilized to the site and really got to work in 2020. That resulted in the excavation of contaminated soil out of 4 residential properties and restoring those properties. We also waterproofed 9 residential crawl spaces and basements with waterproofing along the walls and a drainage system inside each house with a backup pump, all of which were pumping the water out of the houses into a new pipeline that we installed underground, which conveys that collected water from those residential sumps to the CTR area and then back to our treatment facility for treatment. The concentrations of contaminants in this water were not high, but all of these containment steps were necessary in order to prevent exposure to the contaminated groundwater that may be present there. In addition to that, work inside the home and on the residential properties, we installed some additional outdoor, there were some springs that we identified which were contaminated, and we installed sumps to collect that water, also sent it to the CTR, which is our main hub, and over to the treatment plant for treatment. And then, because the water table was higher, those higher elevation parts of that storm sewer pipe that had never been lined had started leaking contaminated groundwater into the pipe, flowing down into Naylor's Run. So we fully sealed that higher section of storm pipe closer to the inlet that's on Lawrence Road, back behind the YMCA on that higher area. We sealed that off as well. In addition to all of this work, we had identified the need for some additional groundwater collection infrastructure, which we started to install in late 2020 and into 2021. However, the treatment plant was already at its maximum capacity. The old treatment plant that had been built under OU2, expanded under OU3, was not enough to keep up with all the water that we were collecting, even after the precipitation rates had dropped down and the water table began to quote-unquote normalized with regards to elevation. So we had a plan to keep the plant running and expand it with an addition onto the side to put in additional larger treatment equipment and eventually bring that whole new expanded plant online. But we encountered an issue where the building in which the plant was housed was not structurally sound, and we could not adequately repair it with any confidence that it would be long-term stable. So we had to make the difficult choice to demolish the building and the treatment plant contents inside. But prior to doing that, we brought in the temporary treatment system, again, not winning any beauty pageants. Right now, that is an amalgamation of different treatment components actually with a higher treatment volume rate than the old plant, and then we had to demolish that facility. So we had to then take our design for this expanded treatment plant and begin to tweak it so that we could so that we could implement a larger groundwater treatment plant construction. That continued into 2022, and we completed all the groundwater infrastructure installation that was needed. That included a new force main that we horizontally drilled underneath the YMCA without having to disturb most of the YMCA's parking lot. It's not under the building itself, it's under the parking lot. We were optimizing the temporary groundwater treatment system, and then we identified the best mechanism to build this new treatment plant, which we know we need to construct, was through this process of the ECA. We cannot just, in order to obtain Superfund money, in order to utilize it for response action, we have to have the right administrative documentation in place. And the size and scope of building a new treatment plant, we could not genuinely authorize under the historic site documents. So we needed to find the best and frankly quickest way to get to a place where we could obtain that funding from EPA headquarters and move forward with the treatment plant, increased treatment plant construction. And the best way to do that is through this ECA process. This ECA is going to lead us into a non-time critical removal action. It sounds like a removal action, and it is, but the only real distinction between a removal and a non-time critical removal is that you can have more than 6 months of planning needed. We know that with the design and construction of this treatment plant, there's far more than 6 months that we're going to need in order to implement it, and the different variations that we're going to discuss, or the different alternatives we'll discuss tonight, lended itself to the ECA process as opposed to some other, I would say, more complicated and probably much more lengthy administrative processes to get us to the same point, which is making sure that we have the ability to build this expanded, larger groundwater treatment plant. I'm sorry. Too many words, and I'm almost done with this first half, and then more to come. So here we are now, 2023. The temporary groundwater treatment system that's there has been expanded. We've kind of pushed it to the limits that it can meet in order to handle as much flow. It's not that it's under capacity, it's more that there's intermittent flows. It's not always the same amount of water that's being collected from every point, and I can discuss that. We have this new groundwater treatment plant that we're close to finishing the design on. We have the ECA, which is out for public comment now, and then what happens next later this year is the non-time critical removal action memo, and I will talk about that as well. Next slide. All right. My last little part here is to just show what all these things that I talked about look like on a map, and talk about this deeper groundwater that we want to address. This map here has been redacted. The big gray area is parts of Rittenhouse Circle and Lawrence Road that are grayed out just from a private information standpoint, because we have been working on residential properties in certain instances. As I mentioned earlier, the hashed area on the left that's got the yellow border, that is our cap. All of the other points that are shown along Eagle Road, RW3, 7, and 5, are our groundwater collection wells. Actually, RW3 is not operational right now, but RW7 and RW5, those are kind of the backbone of our deep groundwater collection system. Further to the east of the YMCA, you see those two large red lines. The longer one, that's shaped like a V, a very flat V, is on that CTR property. That's the original trench. And then the shorter one is a new trench that was installed as part of the time critical removal action to achieve the same purpose. It intercepts shallow groundwater, and then the green line there represents a force main that conveys that water from that trench down to CTR. And CTR1 is that very large green cylinder that I showed a picture of earlier. That's an 18-foot deep sump that is buried, or that is set on the CTR property. It sits on bedrock. It has two twin pumps that each have the ability to pump, I believe, up to 75 gallons per minute. And it really has become our main hub for all groundwater collection. All of the groundwater that's collected from the residential sumps, the spring sump that is shown there in green on the far right, and all of the infrastructure down in that area all go to this CTR1. Think of it as a mega sump. It's huge, it's got all the capacity, it's got backup in order to convey all that water up to the treatment plant, and all of that is done through a pipeline or a series of pipelines that run under the YMCA property. They're not shown on this map, but those lines all run under the YMCA parking lot back to our treatment facility. Next slide. All right, there is, despite the need for the new treatment plant, we've been working here for decades, and we've made a lot of progress with regards to the removal of the contamination mass that's in the groundwater. So this groundwater has moved down not only through the gravel and sand and whatnot that's on top of the bedrock. The bedrock itself is fractured. Typically, in this area, groundwater, the aquifers that are pumped, the water exists in fractures and cracks within the bedrock. And as long as that contamination has been there, it's going to take us at least as long to pump it out, just due to mass balance and the absorption of contaminants into the rock matrix in certain instances. But the point of this map that I wanted to show is you can see the pinkish purple amoeba-like blob that is bordered in the magenta line. That's kind of our current known boundary. And what I wanted to point out is the original, I shouldn't even say original, but the largest extent of the plume that we knew of was back around 2005. And that's shown in that much longer, elongated shape, which shows where the groundwater contamination used to be above our cleanup standards. At this point, the groundwater contamination has been shrunk. The area of contamination has shrunk due to the containment of the groundwater plume in the shallow aquifer and in the deep aquifer, and we've overall reduced the rest of the area that's impacted above our cleanup standards. It's very faint and hard to see, but there's a large dashed green line that encircles this whole area. That represents the boundary of our pumping influence. So basically, any groundwater within that green line down to the depth of our deepest pumping well, which is 120 feet deep, is all within our zone of capture. That's really called our capture zone. So I just wanted to point that out as well. And you can notice the blue lines, the arcing lines there on either side of the plume. Those represent the general direction of groundwater flow in the bedrock for this area. Next slide. All right, last little bit here before the break for questions and discussion. Not doing bad, all right. So one of the things that we did not understand was when this contamination presented itself in these residential properties in 2018 was exactly why it happened. Now we think we know why now. It was because of the water table. And the elevated water table, as I explained. However, there was questions regarding the extent of the groundwater contamination from a depth perspective, whether or not we had really found a bottom on that or not, and whether there might be something that we were missing that could, if it could be something more than just a higher water table. So during the removal action, we drilled 6 new pairs of wells. Shallow wells, which were above the bedrock, and then deeper wells that went up to a depth of almost 300 feet deep. So previously, the deepest well we had on site was 120 feet deep. So we went over nearly 3 times as deep, drilling these wells, and in all locations, we found groundwater contamination, primarily PCP. And in certain instances, we found very high concentrations of PCP. This is not PCP that anybody is exposed to because it's in the deep aquifer and we don't have vapors that emanate off of the groundwater and up into the subsurface and accumulate under buildings. And there's no potable groundwater use in this area. But there were high concentrations in PCP nonetheless. And I have a map to show this in just a second. Our highest concentrations that we noted were actually on the groundwater treatment plant property, right near where the Lobs lumber plant or building existed, and right next to the wood preserver facility, where we had concentrations up to 16,000 parts per billion of PCP. For reference, our cleanup number is 1 part per billion for PCP. So that's where we actually found oils that were floating in the boring that we had drilled in very high concentrations. And that was at a depth of around 125 to 137 feet. But as we move on to the next slide, this is a very busy map, but what I wanted to show with this map is the 6 call-out boxes that circle this area all point to the blue and white circles. And those blue and white circles are those deep borings. And I know it's hard to see all the numbers, but the numbers that are in red represent the highest concentrations that we found. So you can see the very high concentration at 41D to the left, right there, yep. That is the high concentration there right next to the former treatment plant. But we do have concentrations across Eagle Road beneath the YMCA parking lot that go as deep. The contamination was found at 73 parts per billion at 220 feet deep. And then you can see around the area, essentially we had concentrations well above our cleanup standards nearly at every depth. And these depths correspond to the actual fractures in the rock that are producing water. After we drill these borings, we send different sensors down the boring that analyze the rock. They analyze the water that's coming out. It's very cool. It's very helpful to help us understand where the ground, you can have groundwater that's clean coming out of one fracture, and then you can have a contaminated groundwater area coming out of the fracture just above or below it. And really, if you're going to pump these things, you want to pump the right zones, right? You don't want to pump clean water and dirty water if you can hit just the contaminated fractures. And that's one of the critical steps that we're going to be working on as we're moving forward with the non-time critical removal action. Next slide. All right, so this is my last slide here before we're going to take a break and answer any questions that we might have about this or anything else. So I just want to summarize here that the 2019 removal action and everything else that we've done have addressed any current exposure pathways with regards to the site contamination. All known site contamination was removed during the removal, or it's under the cap at the former NWP facility. And all the groundwater that was impacting the residential properties is being captured. It's contained. There's no contamination that we see in the sumps, and the sumps are all of those residential properties have been waterproofed on the inside. We perform annual inspections and repairs where needed on those properties. So those exposure points have been addressed. There's no known, as I said, there's no known surface soil or creek contamination that present an unacceptable risk. We regularly monitor Nailers Run, and we've collected confirmation samples for all of the surface soil and the areas that we excavated. So everything down to approximately 120 feet is within our zone of influence for our capture zone. There might be even a little bit below 120, below that deepest recovery well where we have some influence. That portion of the plume is controlled, and that portion of the plume is the plume that in certain instances has daylighted either in Nailers Run or in residential properties. We've performed in the past 3 different rounds of vapor testing. In certain Superfund sites or non-Superfund site contamination situations, you can have contaminants that can be dissolved in the groundwater or present in the soil that give off vapors. We're all familiar with the odor from, for example, like a can of gas, right? Those are vapors that are volatilizing off of the pure gas that's in there. The same thing can happen from contamination that's dissolved in groundwater or present in soil. If the conditions are right, contaminants can go from solid or liquid form into the vapor form, move up through the bedrock, move up through the overburden, and accumulate under buildings. And in certain instances, vapors can get into the buildings and present a breathing risk. We've done multiple rounds of, it's called vapor intrusion, and we've investigated the potential for vapor intrusion at the site on 3 different instances. And the YMCA, when it was built, put in a vapor mitigation system underneath their foundation. And that vapor mitigation system currently acts passively, but they've tested that, and there's been no accumulation of vapors in there as well. So we know, based upon all the information that we have, that we don't have any current exposure to site contaminants above any of our cleanup standards with regards to any of the media, whether it's groundwater, surface water, soil, or sediments, or vapors. But we do need to investigate this deeper groundwater, mainly because one of our objectives is to restore the aquifer that's contaminated back to a potential beneficial use, make it usable in the future. We can't do that if we're not pumping that water out that's contaminated. So we need to perform additional drilling and investigation to establish not only the vertical extent of how deep that contamination goes, but also laterally, from a horizontal standpoint, have we found the edges. I show you that plume map a couple different times of that big pink amoeba, but we don't know for sure that that's the actual horizontal boundary. We know from a surface standpoint, from the shallow groundwater, what the edges are. We don't know if it's something that extends beyond that as you go deeper, or if it stays within that net. Next slide. All right, that was a lot. I'm really sorry. Hopefully I did not put you to sleep too quickly. But please, I would say if there's any questions, we can discuss them now. There's a microphone right here. If you want to come up to the podium, right, Kelly? We're going to use the podium if you can. Or I don't know if we have to because it's such a small group, but it won't be recorded if we don't. So here we go. All right.
Using your quote, there is no exposure to this groundwater as the aquifer in this area is not used for potable water. That's correct?
Correct, yes.
Is that aquifer used for any other areas of potable water?
So that's a good question. So we have an inventory of all of the known wells anywhere in this area that are used for potable use, and there's none that are within the boundaries of contamination or that are down gradient of our contaminant areas.
Is anyone using this source of water for potable water?
No. No.
You're certain of that?
Based upon all the information that we have, correct, yes.
Thank
I
you.
would say that there are geothermal wells that aren't really using the water, but those borings, we do know of a few properties that are upstream of the site, far west of the site, but we looked at a wide area just to see if we could find any of them, make sure there's no potable use or any kind of wells. But for the sake of being honest, there's geothermal wells where there's basically water that's going down pipes and up out of pipes in bedrock that is, it's contained, it's not touching the groundwater. That's what we're aware of.
When was the last time a fate and transport study was done at the site?
The most recent fate transport study, Shelley, I'm trying to remember the last update of our capture zone. It would have been done as part of the plant design, so it would have been sometime between 2018 and 2020. We would have updated it then because we had to model.
So there's been no fate and transport study done in the last 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's a model that we have that evaluates fate and transport, and as more information is collected, we can update that model.
But in the last 2 to 3 years, your fate and transport studies do not show where these constituents and contaminants have gone in the aquifer, in the groundwater.
Well, it's based upon all the information that we have. So it would show everything as of our most recent data.
Which was 3 years ago.
Right, but so when we perform testing, I see where you're going with this. When we perform sampling of our borings, we look at the information that we have, and we have a full database so that we can compare trends from previous rounds of sampling to new. And that model or that capture zone analysis can be updated with that new data.
And last question, the PCB levels that you have detected, what percentage are they over the federal limits?
Well, our cleanup standard is 1 part per billion. The highest concentrations that we know of on site are 16,000 parts per billion.
Okay,
at
so
a depth of
the federal standard is 1, and you have tested at 16,000.
Correct. Yes.
Thank you.
Yep. Yep.
Angie, can I ask you to pop back 2 slides? I have a question about, I think it's 2 or 3. That one. Yeah. So it looks like the 16,000 parts per million is pretty much like at the top of the hill. Like that's almost your farthest up gradient point, and then everything to the northwest is starting to head toward Darby Creek.
Yeah. Well, I mean, everything flows west to east, but yeah, that's one of our farthest west.
But once you get up there, it starts like down. Where's Lawrence Road? Oh, I'm
Lawrence
looking.
Road is
Yeah, over there.
here.
Okay, so as you.
Right here at 38D, that well is right next to Lawrence Road.
Okay, so as you go down Lawrence Road, it's going down gradient, and there's an old stream over there, or stream channel on the right-hand side, and there's also an old spring house in front of the one building, like the old house, the old farmhouse that was there. As you go down, the new houses, the new subdivision went in behind it.
Yes.
Do you know roughly?
I know roughly where
so
you're.
there's
I'm
a little.
picturing more Darby Road and not Lawrence Road, but I think I know what you're talking about.
So heading down Lawrence Road toward Westchester Pike.
Yes.
Right-hand side, just as you go past the school.
Yes, okay.
Over there on the
Yes,
right, there's a
yeah.
spring house down in there. So you're right about at the point where the water's starting to tip the other way. So maybe your 16,000 may get higher as you go toward the northwest.
Maybe.
Just a
I mean, so the one thing that's
'Cause
not
it's
shown
deep.
on here, there is absolutely. So there is a background well, a nested well that is west of here. But
Oh, okay.
again, it's limited from a depth
Yeah, it's at
perspective
like
to around
120.
100 to 120 feet. So we know so generally the contamination is going to flow with the groundwater flow.
Right.
However, you can have a situation where if you have pure product, like if you have pure oil that's denser than water,
Mm-hmm.
and at this site we're blessed with having both oils that float and oils that sink, okay? And you can have an instance where the oil, the free product, because it's denser than water, for those parts that are, they can drift down through the aquifer without fully dissolving, and then rather than following just the predominant flow direction of groundwater, it can flow along the cracks in the rock. So you could actually have a situation
Like
where you
deep
could,
water this way, shallow water
it could
that
go
way.
any direction,
Yeah.
frankly. It could go straight. So what we see, Shelley, not to put you on the spot, but with regards to the angle or the direction of how bedrock dips in this region, can you speak to that at all? Just a little bit? Because I don't want to, I'm pretty sure I know what it is, but if you can say anything about that.
As of right now, we don't have information on which direction the bedrock cracks are going. Part of the future investigations that we're working on putting together right now are to help analyze some of those bedrock fractures and which directions they go.
Right. So with regards to, all of this is to say, you're right. We do have concentrations that are up gradient that drop off. Only, like, even I could throw a football from one of these locations to the next, from 41D to 39D. It's not very far, but the concentrations do drop off significantly. But it is absolutely we don't have a map in here that shows our planned investigation locations next for our wells, but we are essentially trying to create a new outer ring of monitoring wells around the current known area. Because you can have that instance where groundwater can be going this way, but if your bedrock layers are pointing that way and groundwater goes this way, you can have contamination essentially that rolls down that fracture, that layer.
So
Okay.
my thought for bringing that up is if you have concentrations that high, are you going to have to start recovering from those deep fractures over there as well?
That's the plan, yeah.
And if you do, are you going to have enough capacity?
Yes.
Sorry.
Absolutely. So that's a perfect question, and we talk about this all the time. So in our design, we made an assumption. So I'm going to say here tonight that the ECA is proposing 4 to 8 new recovery wells. We could end up with 3. We could end up with 8. And we make an assumed minimum and maximum amount of water that we could pump from these wells consistently. I'll go into what the numbers are and what we're assuming, but using our capture zone and as part of the design, we made assumptions for the maximum capacity that we would need to pump in order to contain the plume wherever we install these new groundwater wells, in addition to those areas that we're already pumping. So it's a great question, yes. Yes.
So question about 41D, so is the total depth 137 feet of that well?
Correct. That's the max, so yes, that is the maximum depth of that boring.
Are you pumping that well?
We are about to.
Okay.
We are actually about to, we don't have the new treatment facility up now, and the current groundwater that's coming into the plant does not have any free product in it. But we want to pump this out to see, is it just a little bit that's collecting in here, or is it a consistent, not just high concentration groundwater, but are the oils there? So we have to bring we have to rent an oil water separator, bring that on site, because if we were to run oil into our treatment system, it would foul the system and it would have to be cleaned. So within the next week or two, the oil water separator is slated to be delivered, and then that will be hooked up to the temporary system, and we'll start pumping that boring to see what we get.
So I guess when you have like very significantly different concentrations at different levels, are you leaving those sort of open borehole wells?
We will not leave them open permanently.
Okay.
These borings or their descendants will be converted either into monitoring wells or into full recovery wells. And for the non-initiated, generally what we want to do when we have a well is you have a pipe that goes down it. Generally, it's PVC, and there's slots in the PVC that are cut so that you can pump water into those zones. And around that PVC, within the boring, you fill that with either sand or with clay, called bentonite clay, to seal off the areas that you don't want to pump from and to ensure that your hole stays open. So right now we have open borings, and we want to complete those so that we can pump from the proper zones, or we might put a well in that is screened from bottom to top, but at least we have it completed so that it will stay competent and open. Okay.
Back to the question of the dip and strike of the bedrock, I'm a little surprised that how many years, 40 years down the road, we haven't figured out what the dip and strike of the bedrock is.
I would say that I don't think Shelley wants to go there because we're still in the process. We've conducted geophysical evaluations of our borings, and there's dip and strike information in there.
Okay.
So dip, for the uninitiated, now or later, is basically, the dip is if the bedrock layer that we're dealing with is not flat, how is it dipping? And then at what kind of angle is that happening relative to wherever we're talking? From a true north perspective, et cetera. So basically dip and strike, we want to talk about that, and I'm not a geologist, so don't give me that funny look. But generally it's what is the overall orientation of the rock layers, the fractures that are down there. In addition to the geophysical work that we've done on the borings, we'll do that on all the new wells that we're going to talk about, and we're planning to collect, if we can get the rock out of the hole, to do a solid core, or we can get the entire rock. The formation that we deal with in this area is very old, and it can tend to be busted up as you try and extract a full core that's whole as you pull it out of the ground.
I wasn't worried about the water going in the wrong direction until Darren mentioned it, but
Because that's where we start to hit the divide where stuff is Harvey Creek instead of toward.
hopefully all your wells will answer that question.
I would say, yeah, that is the intent. I mean, it may not be that the next round of wells that we drill this year answer all of the questions, but we need to drill where we can get access, see what we find, and then step out. And then honestly, it's not only a question of depth, but horizontal extent.
Don't sell yourself short, by the way. You're probably an honorary dirt ball.
Hey, thanks. I've been doing it long enough. Yes.
Question, if we live back by Paddock Park, can this stuff go back that way by any chance?
That's
I
kind
don't
of-
quite understand how all
Right.
this works, but
You wouldn't expect it, but the question is, if the
It's tipped that way.
right, if the beds are tipping the wrong way, bad things could happen because of the density.
I would say, from a non-oil, non-free product standpoint, the groundwater plume it's very well defined which direction it's moving. It's moving to the east.
Okay.
It's moving from the source area, which was the National Wood Preservers property, and the areas where that material sat on the ground, leached into the soil, and then it moved east. Absolutely, it's a west to east flow regime, and it's all wanting to flow in the shallower aquifer towards Naylor's Run. Generally speaking, groundwater wants to flow towards creeks. That's why the creeks are there, because they're receiving groundwater. I think that the question that Darren brings up is it's a legitimate one because we're talking about dense product, free product that can go down and sink. But the date, so we have to drill more wells in order to determine what the extent of that is. And it would be something that would generally be moving deeper. If it's going to be moving against the direction of groundwater flow, that would be something that would be migrating deeper into the fractures as it's going, just because If it's a floater, if it's a lighter oil, it would.
With the water.
Right, it's not gonna be riding along that plane.
Yeah, it's sitting on the surface of the rock, moving
Right.
its way down the surface of
I
the
see.
rock, not necessarily floating
Okay.
with the groundwater.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
One other quick question too. What happens if you were a kid and you drank out of the creek?
I mean,
Like,
now,
well, no, like in the
Or-
70s or something like that. Would you be alive, is what I want to know.
Bob, would you like to help answer that?
Because I was one of those kids, that's why I'm asking.
So, Bob Halverson here is one of our colleagues that was not on the slide, and I apologize. Bob
That's
works
okay.
for an arm of the CDC called the Agency for Toxic Substances Disease Registry, ATSDR, and they help us out with these kind of toxicological and potential risk questions. So,
Yeah.
I'll let you talk about that.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm healthy now.
No, it's a fair question. And in the past, those exposures, I think, would have been concerning for help. I don't think, death would be something immediate, but I think health effects were possible at those concentrations before EPA came on board and started treating. I think the concern is, multiple chemicals there. And over the years, I have talked to people who have lived there generations right out their back door with those concerns and talked to them about that. And we've worked with the Pennsylvania Department of Health to gather information about cancer incidents in the community here. And, I do think that that's a concern that was relevant back before treatment occurred. And Nowers Run is certainly one that was pretty heavily contaminated. And some of this stuff drops out and stays in the sediment for a while. And so those cleanups were important. You would see, at the concentrations I think there may have been back then, you would see some health effects and a very high cancer risk. So yeah, and so when you think about that, those exposures that could have resulted in cancers, there's a latency, there's a time from exposure to the cancer actually occurring. And those statistics that we've looked at for the last 25 or so years, we don't see the types of cancers that would occur, but it's tough to really focus in on the people in those homes with cancer incidents because usually they look at a larger geographic area. That's where their statistics are drawn from, like multiple block areas instead of right along the run. So I don't think that I don't think it's a concern now. I think back then there probably were some exposures that were concerning, and people may have had health effects, and there may have very well been some cancer occurrences.
But it would have impacted you within years after doing it, not?
10, 15 years or less, I think, and we're talking really high exposure, so people would have had physical health effects besides the cancer from those exposures.
Okay, thank you, that helped, thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Any other questions at this point? All right, so we're going to move on now. We're right on schedule. Just saying something for me. All right, so what I want to do now for the rest of this discussion is get into the details of this ECA, help try and make sense of it. I want to point out that we're in the middle of the public comment period. This ECA is available on the Havertown PCP Superfund website. It's the full administrative record, which includes all the documents that served as the basis for our development of that ECA, are all available. It's also available at the local free library in Havertown. You can view it there. And I say that because what I'm about to go through is not going to cover every single sentence or every single paragraph in the ECA. This is meant to be an overview to help further the understanding of what's there, because despite, it's a technical document, and it's not always written it's not written just for public consumption. It's written for regulatory purposes. So there's certain things in there that have to be said in a certain way. And I just say that as a commercial for going to check out the full ECA itself if you want to learn more about that, and submit comments during the public comment period. And feel free to reach out to myself or Angie at any time during the public comment period. So, all right, so as I mentioned, this ECA is meant to inform the basis of a non-time critical removal action. It's going to be a non-time critical removal action for the specific treatment plant, for the treatment plant question. What do we want to do for treating the groundwater? It's not meant to replace what's on site and all the other decision documents and decisions that we've made. It's really meant to be add on to what's there. It's replacing the old treatment plant, but everything else, all the other requirements from all the other decisions that we made on site are still going to be in full force and effect. This is just an addition to that. So the goal of the ECA is you have to identify what the objectives are that you want to achieve in the removal action itself. You want to identify options to meet those objectives or potentially meet those objectives. And we call them alternatives in the document, but it's options. It's what are the different options to achieve the objectives in the document. And we want to analyze these different options against the same criteria. We look at the effectiveness of that option, the implementability of that option, and the cost of that option. And I just also want to mention that this entire presentation is going to be part of the administrative record, and it will be part of the website as well. I know I'm going over a lot, and I see some people taking notes, and that's great, but just know that all of this will be available as well when we're done here. Next slide, please. This is essentially the table of contents for the ECA. It's as you would kind of expect. It's got an intro, it's got a lot of site background like I went over tonight. We talk about the removal action objectives, which I'll go over next. There is an identification of our different alternatives. We do a comparative analysis. We do an analysis of each of those alternatives against those criteria and against each other's alternatives. And then there's a recommended removal action alternative at the end of the ECA, which I mentioned is the recommended new groundwater treatment plant with 175 gallon per minute treatment. And then there's a reference section at the end. Next slide. This is the worst slide you're going to look at tonight, maybe ever, and I'm really sorry, but because I want to be thorough, I've taken the word for word 3 objectives out of the ECA. I'm not going to sit here and read them to you, but I did want to highlight a couple things. So there's 3 objectives, and the first 2 objectives actually have 2 sub-objectives, if you will. One, we want to make sure that we will contain the shallow and the deep parts of the aquifer that are contaminated. This is a very important distinction, that we want to hit both the shallow and the deep groundwater. And we also want to make sure that we make sure that we are preventing the down gradient movement of groundwater contamination. And this would really inform in any direction. Down gradient can mean different things. Generally, down gradient means downstream, the groundwater is flowing this way. We don't want it to go any further than it already is. If you remember in that one slide I had, you can see how much the groundwater plume has shrank over time. That's stopping things from going further down gradient. But down gradient could apply to this moving down the bedrock surface if it's happening. Within the second objective, we want to fit into the overall long-term cleanup strategy for this site and achieve the remedial goal objectives for groundwater. I've got a real doozy of a slide coming up next that's almost as bad as this one that talks about all of our individual numerical cleanup standards, which we won't go into, but again, I want to just give you a sense of what's going on with the cleanup standards. So we want to be consistent with our previous cleanup numbers that we've selected, and we want to we want to treat all of the groundwater that we collect, we want to treat it to the standards that we're already meeting, which are based under the regulations from the Clean Water Act. And then we also want to contribute to and speed up the overall long-term cleanup of the groundwater contamination at the site through this non-time critical removal action. Next slide. Here's that slide. So again, you can peruse this at your own leisure. This is from the OU3 record of decision, which was the final groundwater cleanup. And these are all the different groundwater cleanup numbers that we want to eventually meet in the bedrock aquifer, or actually in any of the groundwater. And my point in putting this up here is to show the long list of different compounds and inorganics that we have included with cleanup standards. But I also want to show that there are standards that exist for each of them, and I want to highlight the 2 basically key drivers of the work that we've done. It's the pentachlorophenol and the total dioxin. So as I mentioned earlier, PCP has a cleanup standard in the groundwater of 1 part per billion, and the total dioxins have a cleanup standard of 0.00003 parts per billion, which is even less than 1 part per trillion. So we don't really have a lot of dioxins that we're collecting anymore into the treatment plant. But that doesn't mean that they aren't present above cleanup standards somewhere else in the aquifer. It's just that the overall volume of groundwater that we're bringing into the system does not have dioxins currently above our cleanup standards overall. Next slide. There's 3 alternatives that are evaluated in the ECA. There is the alternative number 1, which seems ludicrous and crazy, and why would you put it in here in the first place? And the answer is that we're required to, which is to do nothing, which means no action. Alternative 1 would be to abandon the groundwater treatment plant. It's not that we would ever consider actually doing that, it's just a no action alternative is required to be included in all of these types of documents. The second alternative is to continue collection of the groundwater and treating it with a system that's already present. It's there, it's working, it's a temporary system that is a combination of different treatment components, and to leave it as is, treating approximately 100 gallons per minute, continue operating that in perpetuity and monitoring the site. And then the third alternative is to build the new permanent groundwater treatment plant and to install additional recovery wells. This third alternative, as I have mentioned kind of multiple times, involves a capacity of at least 175 gallons per minute treatment, anywhere between 4 to 8 additional recovery wells in addition to what we already have. We would operate this facility. First, after it was built by EPA, we would run the plant for a period of time before we would transition it back to the Pennsylvania DEP. And the temporary treatment system that's present would be dismantled as soon as the new treatment plant was operational and demonstrated to be working properly, and we would continue with our long-term monitoring of the site. The reason why recovery wells were not included under Alternative 2 is essentially because this treatment system does not have the capacity to handle additional water. Even with dismantling of the temporary system and bringing in a new system, we are limited by our spatial constraints there, and the type of temporary system is there, that the recovery wells would not be practicable with that temporary system in any real meaningful way. Next slide. All right, so these are just the different factors within the 3 main evaluation criteria that we look at in the ECA. Under effectiveness, we're looking at, just like what it says, how will this technology perform? How protective will it be while we're building it? How protective will it be for the public, for the workers that are constructing it? Does it work in the short term? And what about the long term? Long-term effectiveness is going to be one of the things we're going to talk about a lot in a minute. Are we reducing the toxicity, mobility, or volume of the contamination that's there? Are we complying with those ARARs, which is all the state, federal, and local laws and regulations that might pertain, and any kind of residual other effect concerns of the treatment system process, or any alternative. Implementability, how well can you put into action the alternative that you're evaluating in that ECA, or in that alternative? Is it something that's novel and never been done before? Are the materials available? Is there expertise? Is there knowledge on how to design and build any type of alternative? What is the community and the state's perception or the acceptance of that alternative? And what types of approvals or permits would be required, or permit equivalents? And then in our ECA, we have actual estimated costs, but sometimes in an ECA, you can have a high, medium, low cost evaluation. We went more detailed on this one, but cost is the other main component, obviously. Next slide, please. So under Alternative 1, we are not evaluating that any further in the ECA. As I said, it's meant to serve as a baseline. It's a requirement for these types of feasibility study, engineering evaluation study type documents, but it would not meet any of our objectives, and it's not considered any further. Give me a moment, please. All right. So I tried to, again, so in the ECA document, there is a lot of discussion on this evaluation. I've tried to condense this into bullets here. And I will not bore you with reading each one word for word off the page, but what I want to hone in on is that the Alternative 2, with the temporary groundwater treatment system staying in place, That is considered to be protective. It's protective right now. It's complying with all the laws and regulations right now. It's reducing contamination through treatment and sending the treatments, the sludge that comes out of the treatment plant off-site for disposal. But it is not effective, this temporary treatment system, because we cannot tap into the deeper groundwater, whatever the extent of that contamination is, we cannot address that due to the capacity constraints of the treatment system. Which means we cannot achieve that first removal action objective, which was to address and contain that shallow and deep groundwater component. So thus, if whatever the extent of the deep groundwater plume is, this alternative could not tap into that. Wherever those new recovery wells need to go, this treatment system can't address all of that. If we were to hit higher concentration areas of dioxins and start having high concentration dioxins coming into the treatment system, we used to have an ultraviolet oxidation process, which is very bright lamps that are helping with pre-treatment of the water with peroxide to destroy the dioxins that are in there. Those lamps are very high voltage, very high electricity draw. We have not needed them for several years because the dioxins come into the plant below our cleanup standards. But if we were to hit higher concentrations of dioxins coming into the treatment plant for treatment, the temporary treatment system really is not designed to handle that type of electrical load on site. It would not really be, nor because we don't have a weatherized, perfect building in there, that the installation of a UV oxidation system would not really be practicable. So we would have that constraint if we were to have those dioxin levels go higher. And one could expect that when you start pulling in new high concentration groundwater with high concentrations of PCP, and because we've seen PCP historically co-located with dioxins and furans, you could potentially see higher concentrations. We haven't seen that in the groundwater that we've hit thus far, but it could happen. And there's no weatherized building that exists right now for that treatment facility. Any of you have driven by, I didn't put any pictures up here, I apologize. I wasn't trying to avoid looking at it, I just forgot to put them in here, I apologize. But a lot of things have been bolted together, and it's, there's exterior components and large frac tanks that are there. There's the temporary tent that's out there. It's not weatherized, it's not weatherproof. From an implementability standpoint, however, it's already there. We are running that treatment facility now, so it is readily implementable. The challenge becomes in the long term. We don't have any solid steel piping out there or PVC. Generally, it's rubber hoses that connects the different parts of the site. Those are fine for short term, but the temporary system is just what the name says. It's meant to be temporary. No more than 5 years, but really on the time scale of 1 to 2 years before you need to start switching out different components and different processes within the temporary treatment system. So it is implementable, but things start to get more challenging the longer that treatment system sits out there. From a cost perspective, on an annual basis, it costs around $1.7 million to run that temporary treatment facility now. That's equipment that we don't own, we rent that. We have a subcontractor that's operating that facility or that treatment system. And we've discussed the details more when it comes to the monitoring and whatnot that would happen as part of this. That's all included in the ECA, but what it boils down to is about $1.7 million per year right now, plus a little bit of a contingency moving forward on an annual basis. Next slide. For alternative 3, it's very similar when you start talking about the effectiveness with the temporary treatment facility, only we have the added bonus that we have a much greater longer-term effectiveness of this treatment system. In the short term, a full groundwater treatment plant would be protective of human health and the environment. We would meet all the laws and regulations that we need to meet. It is a full state-of-the-art groundwater treatment plant. And then we would have that additional capacity. We would have the additional deeper groundwater recovery wells that will be placed in the correct depths and locations such that we can achieve the entirety of all the removal action objectives, addressing both the shallow and the deep groundwater. There is room that has been set aside in this building that we've conceptually designed to put in a UV oxidation system, an air stripper, any other type of treatment component that might be needed. It's worth noting that we've been running this treatment facility, and it's like the temporary treatment system that's there now is just like the one that used to be there, only it's put together in a different order, but it's the same general process components. We have a recipe that works for treating this groundwater, and every wastewater treatment plant has its own unique foibles and things that you have to deal with. Ours has to do with the hardness of the water and the manganese and the iron that we have in this area and some other unique constraints. But it's a known recipe in how to achieve the treatment of this groundwater to the standards that we need to hit. But we've set aside this area in the case that we have these dioxins coming in. We would have the additional bolt-on capacity within the facility to handle not only the spatial, but the electrical load as well. And we would have a weatherized, fully brand new, nice looking building, very similar kind of to what you see out there now when you look at the YMCA, Mr. Storage, things like that. I have a few pictures of that at the end as well, or renderings. From an implementation standpoint, it would be a typical wastewater treatment plant construction. It will be tight quarters because we have all the temporary treatment facility there now. However, we do have the room to build the facility there. And this is a standard type of wastewater treatment plant design that we will be implementing. The skills are available, the labor, the materials, the engineering are all known and readily accessible and implementable. Same thing goes for drilling. Not only have we drilled wells the right way and the wrong way in this area in order to tap into wherever the groundwater contamination is located, we have that ability. There is the potential, either from a stormwater management standpoint, we need to upgrade our facility. We can't do that under the temporary treatment system because we have a lot of our tanks are sitting where the groundwater or where the stormwater swale used to be. But under this new alternative 3, we would be looking to upgrade our stormwater management so we could handle not only our stormwater, but the up gradient stormwater that runs onto our facility, which may eventually end up in some upgrades to the piping that goes under Eagle Road. So we potentially would have to have a couple off hours closures of parts of Eagle Road, think night work, night and weekend work, to expand the size of the piping or put in different piping. It's never anything that anybody wants to talk about, but it can be done. Road closures happen all the time, road cuts happen all the time. We would want to minimize the inconvenience, but it's definitely doable. From a cost standpoint, because we don't have this groundwater treatment plant out there now, there's capital costs that are involved. We estimate, even though you can see that there's many different pieces of equipment that are on site now, some of which that will work in this new groundwater treatment plant, we still have capital costs to build this facility. And we estimate that they will total just about $16.3 million for the construction costs. When it comes to operation, we estimate that once the plant is built, it would be up to 24 months of EPA operating the treatment plant to prove it out, to commission everything, to ensure that everything is operating as it should be, to conduct monitoring, to show that we're meeting all the right standards of performance. And the 2-year cost for operating that facility, it's actually quite similar. It's about $1.7 million a year to run this new facility, which is just over the current temporary treatment system. So for a 2-year cost, it's just under $4 million. So the total cost for this alternative from the EPA portion of the cost for capital and running it is $20.2 million. Next slide, please. Okay. Here's my handy dandy cheat sheet that I keep for myself when I'm evaluating these criteria. And a check mark here means that in this instance, under alternative 2, the lack of a check mark under meeting all of the RAOs, that alternative does not do that, so we don't meet that criteria there. Also, from a long-term protectiveness standpoint, alternative 2 does not achieve that long-term effectiveness as we cannot have the deeper groundwater recovery wells. From an implementation standpoint, alternative 2 gets a check plus because it's already been implemented, so it's already there. There's very minimal capital costs that would need to be dedicated to do any kind of upgrades there. And from a cost perspective, alternative 2 is cheaper However, it does not meet the critical threshold criteria of meeting all of our removal action objectives. Next slide. So to reiterate, this recommended alternative is number 3, and it involves a treatment plant with a capacity of up to 175 gallons per minute at a minimum. And we would have a new permanent treatment facility, a new permanent building, and additional groundwater investigation will be conducted in order to delineate the extent of that groundwater contamination that I talked about earlier. And we estimate anywhere between 4 to 8 additional recovery wells would be needed in addition to what we already have. So on site, we already have 3 operational groundwater recovery wells and 2 trenches, and then 2 sumps as well, 2 spring sumps. So this would be in addition to that. We've conducted, for the open bedrock borings that we have right now, we conducted 24-hour pump tests recently, back in November, where we pumped 2 wells at the same time. We had 4 wells, so we pumped 2 and 2. Basically, we have 2 new wells that are on either side of Eagle Road, and we pumped them kind of one on each side for 24 hours. And we collected samples of contamination every 4 hours to see what was happening to the contaminant levels. Do we have just a little bit that flushes out right away, or do we have a consistent concentration? Those wells averaged anywhere between 8 to 14 gallons per minute on average. So that's a good yield that we would like to see out of those wells. And we did see in most instances the contaminant levels would either stay static, or in the case of that high concentration well that's on the treatment facility, we saw contaminant concentrations increasing every 4 hours up until the end of the test, which is a good thing because it means that we're tapping into something. Now, if we had run that test for 7 days, I don't know, at some point it would level off. It may be more than 7 days though, who knows? So that's what we did. We hit a really good spot there. That's why we're going to start pumping it now, just to see what we can get out of it and what kind of stability we see in the contaminant concentrations. And when this is all said and done, we are good neighbors. We want to clean up the property just from an appearance standpoint. So there will be restoration of the property with regards to landscaping, frontage effects, things like that. All right, this is our conceptual render. Why are you laughing? It looks good. I like it. It is. It's
better than the tent.
It is better than the tent. Yeah. So the tent is kind of situated right now where those 3 trucks are in the front. One thing that's not really shown on this side of the treatment plant, you're like kind of on the Mr. Storage side. It may not all be. It probably wouldn't all be grass there. It would be a smaller stormwater swale. We're hoping that we can convey some of our stormwater through that swale, but we have some other plans to get that stormwater into some piping and all essentially getting to where it all goes now, which is Nailers Run, underground. All the stormwater that falls and runs onto our property comes from Mr. Storage and all the facilities up gradient. We have to handle that, and that's fine. Ultimately, it all ends up in Nailers Run now. We're working on some alternative stormwater management plans to help split that flow, as even in the best of situations, we're spatially constrained where that stormwater swale runs between Mr. Storage and our plant. Our liner runs underneath that swale, so we can only go so deep. We can't dig very deep and then put in some big containment tank there. And we don't want to infiltrate stormwater on this facility, because infiltrating stormwater would be flushing contamination that's under the cap. But we have some plans for that as well. Next slide. There's just a couple other pictures here of renderings of what it would look like from a different perspective. Generally speaking, we would have some typical landscaping and surface restoration. Next slide. And then this is kind of looking at it just a little bit down the road. You can see where we would be standing right at the YMCA entrance. Next slide. All right, so I have 2 more slides, and then we can talk more about what you think about all of this or any other questions that come to mind. From a schedule standpoint, what are our next steps? This public comment period will end on March 15th. And during this time, I will be preparing the draft action memo that we're working on. And that action memo for the non-time critical removal action, we're hoping that we can finalize that in April. And it's worth noting that because we're in a public comment period, any substantial comments provided during the public comment period will be responded to as part of the action memo. Not only is there a record of the comments received, but there's responses that are provided as well. The goal is to be ready to request our funding. This says May of 2023. I actually learned today it's more likely end of April 2023 when we'll be requesting that funding from EPA's National Priority Panel. It's a group of individuals that decides on which sites get new funding funding for new cleanups. Our expectation is that we would be using the bipartisan infrastructure law funding as part of this work. So if that all pans out, we are hoping that we'll be issuing our contract award to the construction contractor by this summer, ideally in June, and we would see that contractor mobilizing to the site and getting really started by the end of the summer, August of 2023. In the meantime, we have our, what I'll call our drilling program that we're gearing up for now to drill some additional groundwater wells in various locations throughout the neighborhood, throughout the site, to delineate the extent of this deeper plume. I will say that we are trying as much as possible not to inconvenience anybody during the drilling. We are not going onto private property if at all possible. We don't want to bother private businesses, private homes. So we are trying to stick to, frankly, roadways, open space, and even in open space areas. For example, somewhere in Paddock Park, we're looking to drill a well. We don't obviously want to drill a well wherever there's a ball field in Paddock Park, so we would want to stay on the periphery there, right? I don't want to make any new enemies, and we want to be a good neighbor. So there will be street closures. There will be temporary closures of the Pennsy Trail, which I know will not win us any love letters in the mail, but before we do any of that, we want to coordinate with the ward commissioners, with the township, and let local residents know when we're going to be drilling. I'd like to get feedback from the ward commissioners, the EAC, on, hey, have you thought about doing this? Or some other step that we can take to help notify individuals better about what's happening, hours of drilling, anything like that. We always learn things. We always don't have every box checked when we're planning all of these big drilling efforts or investigatory efforts. So there'll be more to come on that. Next slide. So what to expect during construction? As I mentioned, from between May and July, we're hoping to have our drill operation ongoing around the site. If all goes to plan, all goes to schedule, we would see in January or through March of next year, the actual treatment building being erected and constructed. That would mean that the foundation is hopefully on schedule to be laid late this year. It will be a challenge, I can tell you, just from getting the contractor on board and then lining up the right subcontractors. One of the most complicated parts of this construction is actually the foundation. All of our piping, all of our drains, pedestals for the different plant components all fit into this slab. So this foundation is not a flat foundation. There are anchors and there are pylons for the facility building. So that's one of the more bigger lifts right at the start of the project. But if we can get that all done by March through December of next year, you would see the building would be up, and then all of the different tradesmen and the different trades would be putting together the treatment plant itself inside. At the same time, as we're wrapping up the work at the end of 24, the stormwater management upgrades would be one of the last things we do. We have a stormwater management system in place now that works, but it's not a permanent solution. So once that temporary treatment plant is out and after the new facility has been constructed, the new stormwater upgrades would go in. Hopefully by early 2025, we're wrapping everything up in the spring, finishing our landscaping, any other kind of finishing effects. What we don't really know, and I should say kind of for this whole schedule, is how does our construction contractor want to go about this? We will give them the design, the drawings, the specifications, but it will be their job to tell us how they want to do it, since they are going to be on the hook for building a facility that meets all of our requirements. So the schedule could change, the order of these things could change, but this is our best guess based upon our professional experience, myself, Bob, Colin, Tetra Tech, everybody, we kind of talked about how this could shake out. And this is our best estimate right now, professionally speaking. A couple things we really don't know is when would the road closures happen? It may be that we don't have to close Eagle Road at all. We may be able to do all of our work under Hillcrest. It may not even be necessary. We might have some, it may just be the access road that we own that we need to disturb. But we just don't know that yet. And exactly when the recovery wells fit into this, some of the ones that are on our facility, those could be done right away. Some of the ones that are further afield, especially if they're across Eagle Road or south of Lawrence or north or west of the site, the further away you go, the more we have to deal with the constraints on access, easements, things of that nature in the future. Next slide. What will you hear? So what this means is, when will you see us next? I hope that we can have some additional coordination and communication with the township, with the EAC, with the ward commissioners as we're preparing for our upcoming drilling activities, as I mentioned. I'd like to do another community event, community meeting, once we have the design done, the action memo done, and the construction contract, if not awarded, very, very close. So I'm hoping that could be sometime in the May to June timeframe, where we can get together, provide an update. Ideally, it's when we have our construction contractor on board. We can bring them out so everybody can meet them. They can give everybody their lay of the land, hear from individual members of the community if they haven't already, and go forward. And we want to be a good neighbor all the way around on this. We know that the facility is doing its job. The treatment facility that we have now works, but it's not great to look at. I think I've driven that one home, and I've heard that from many people. So, but while we're building, we want to be considerate and minimize impacts to the community, whether it's noise, traffic, any other kind of disturbances. It doesn't mean that we won't be a pain in the butt sometimes. It doesn't matter that our construction won't interfere with things periodically, but we really want to work together to troubleshoot before the big problems occur so that they don't occur. Next slide. And that's it. Not bad on time. Those who know me know I struggle with those things. So, thank you. Other questions, comments, anything about what I just went over?
Just one quick question. If you do drill like in Paddock Park, like you were saying, is there any, if you do drill in Paddock Park or anything like that, is there any risk to kids or anything like that from the drilling itself, or the residents, the residual dirt or whatever
That's a good question. So from a health perspective, there shouldn't be, as long as the drillers are operating under standard protocols. It'd be more of a physical hazard concern. So when we drill, the areas around where we drill there's an off-limits area, and we will have flaggers that kind of keep people out of our area. But when you drill, you generate water that comes up out of the hole, and there is a holding tank that water gets pumped into immediately. It's not like it's pumped onto the ground. And the same thing goes with the rock cuttings. All of that is contained as it comes up out of the hole.
Okay, great. And will this ever go away, out of curiosity, like the problem, or is it like one of these things that's going to be here for thousands of years or something?
I don't know if I would say thousands of years, and I'm not trying to be trite.
No,
I think that that the treatment is working, and I think that we are shrinking the overall area of contamination. But it's certainly, I think we have multiple decades before we could ever expect to reasonably see the plume of contamination even being contained underneath the footprint of the wood treatment facility. If you could put extraction points exactly where all the contamination is and just constantly pump that water out, you are restricted by the amount of water that you can use we're using that water to flush what's there, and that rock is like a sponge. And so some of the contamination is absorbed into the rock, so that has to flux out of the rock. And that can only happen at a certain capacity anyway. We have toyed with other technologies that potentially could work, but they are very risky. And it would involve things like heating the ground so that you would boil off everything that's down there. And I think that when you think about what could happen, if you were going to boil off all the contamination into a vapor phase, you have to get it very hot, and we're under a very densely populated area.
Right.
So I think that we're looking at multiple decades before you can really get down there.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for your time. We
Thank you.
appreciate the information.
No problem. And I would actually, so one other thing that from like a treatment perspective, that ROS area, if you, Angie, could you scroll back? Because I didn't really point it out. Or I don't know if it's even in, yeah, go back to the map that shows the old and the new. Yeah. No. Keep going. Oh, go forward. So the ROS area is shown down there in the very bottom right-hand side. And you can see the neon, like the teal line. That's the line that brought the contamination in. So in that area, we dug out the contaminated soil in 2010, and then there's 3 groundwater recovery wells that are there now, but they only pump about 1 gallon a minute. And those wells went clean, so we stopped pumping them. And there's a monitoring wells that surround them as well. And so we're not pumping that area anymore. And you will see generally that there's no contaminants down there. However, every once in a while, we will see little spikes of contaminants in the water. And it's really just kind of sitting there. So we are looking at a few innovative approaches. There are one of the most exciting, I sound like a salesman, what an exciting opportunity I have for you. One of the most exciting parts of the environmental remediation world is the use of microbial breakdown of contaminants. Whether it's through the microbes actually consuming the contaminants that are in the ground, or if the microbes are eating something else, but essentially they're either using those contaminants to respirate, or essentially their saliva, their enzymes that eat those other things are also co-metabolizing the other contaminants that are in the ground. So because the little ROS area is, for all intents and purposes, clean, but we see these little pockets of little low-level contamination in groundwater, and it's shallow, we're looking at doing some studies to see if any of the microbes that are known to degrade PCP or other longer chain hydrocarbon molecules, we want to see if they're present. It's a shot in the dark, and it may or may not ever pan out. But if they're present, or if the conditions are right, you can inoculate that area with these naturally occurring microbes. But they just may not be naturally occurring in that area. Or you can inject a substrate that they would start to eat, like molasses or lactate, or other kind of innocuous, non-impacting chemicals, not chemicals, but like compounds that they could consume. So it's a lot of ifs, and it may not pan out, but we are looking to see if that could work there. And if that works in the ROS area, there's potential that we could use that to kind of just help in other areas of the site if the conditions are right. But it's a lot of ifs, and it's more a science project at this point, but you never know. We do use that, we use microbial degradation as the backbone of a lot of our cleanups in other sites. So it's definitely implementable. It's just a matter if the conditions are right. Yes, sir.
Thank you for this very helpful presentation.
You're welcome.
You are recommending alternative number 3, correct?
Correct.
Yes. And am I correct that the EPA has the responsibility for the O&M for 24 months for that?
Approximately, yes. Yeah, okay. I mean, that's not a defined number, but that's what we're assuming how long we would operate the plant.
So for 1 to 2 years?
Correct.
On the O&M on that, right?
Yep.
Operations and maintenance. And your projected cost of that is $2 to $3 million?
For the
Per year
to
of
run the
O&M?
plant for 24 months would be just under $4 million.
Okay. After the 24-month commitment from the federal government expires, that obligation transfers to the Commonwealth?
Correct.
Yeah. So if it was $2 to $4 million a year during the first 2 years of the O&M responsibility, what is your projection of the financial responsibility onto the Commonwealth after year 2, when 100% of that obligation will be on the Pennsylvania taxpayers?
I mean, we would expect that the annual costs would remain similar within a plus or minus of a small percentage over time. You might be able to realize certain efficiencies. You may be able to eventually turn off some recovery wells, which means the less water you treat, the less chemicals you use, the less electricity you use. But generally, the sorry,
But-
the Commonwealth and EPA have a contract together that where we each have documented commitment to the estimated costs for our responsibilities.
I appreciate that. So the federal government's obligation is for 2 years at about $4 million.
Total, yeah, so it's
Right.
about like, yeah,
Right.
1.7,
And after that, 100% of the obligation goes to the Commonwealth taxpayers, correct?
correct, yes.
And how long, 2 years for the feds, how long do you project the Commonwealth will have that obligation of $2 to $4 million per year? You mentioned earlier decades. I think it's what is. Will this obligation of $2 to $4 million per year go on for decades?
The estimate, yes, the estimate that we use as a standard is 30 years for our
Okay.
cost estimation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In May, a couple of months from now, the request will be made for NPO listing. Am I correct on that?
No, we're already on the national.
We are on the
What we're
NPL
going
right
for
now?
in April is, I should have been more clear. So when you want to start a new cleanup, and this technically is a new action at an old site, you have to go every year. There is a meeting where all of the sites that are requesting new cleanup money go to this national priority panel.
Right.
And they rank all of these sites and they decide.
And
which
we are
sites go.
ranked now?
We haven't gone to the panel. So I mean.
So we are not ranked on the national
Oh,
priority
no, it's
list?
separate. The national.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. The national priorities list is separate from the, I can see why it's, the body of EPA officials from headquarters and the regions, I'm sorry. And watch is saying I have an abnormally high heart rate. Yeah. No, I'm okay.
I'm going to tell my wife that
Right.
tonight. She's going
So, don't take it personally. So NPL listing, like, NPL means we're Superfund site. My director, Charlie, I did not introduce him, is here, and he probably can more eloquently explain it than I can.
Yes, so I'm Charlie Root. I'm the Superfund Site Remediation Branch Chief for Region 3. So Bob and Josh are two of the remedial project managers out of the 48 that work in my group, and they cover 229 Superfund sites in the 5 states that we cover in our region. So we are, the Havertown site is on the national priorities list. What Josh was alluding to is that, you know, in the prior years leading up to last year, we've got our funding, just like all other federal agencies, through appropriation from Congress. After the trust fund, the Superfund trust fund had been drawn down and it wasn't being replenished by the taxes anymore. So that changed when the bipartisan infrastructure law was in place. But because we all were competing for the same pie of appropriated funding across the country, right? So we have 229 sites in our region. There's 10 regions in the United States that all have Superfund sites in them as well. So we were competing for the same construction money all across the country. So what we would do is, you know, myself, my counterparts in all the other 9 regions in the country, we go and we basically present and try to convince each other the priority of funding of the sites across the country based on, you know, whether the site has immediate risks. And it's usually, you know, the biggest priority is taking care of the things that are the riskiest to folks and exposures, taking care of known exposures first. The less important ones are usually, unfortunately, things like, you know, sites that are driven by ecological risks or that are very low contaminants in a diffuse plume kind of thing. So obviously that has changed now because there's the bipartisan infrastructure funding, which was an infusion of $3.5 billion into the Superfund program specifically for construction of remedies across the country. Right now, we're in the middle of that, drawing down that funds across the country. And this site, it will qualify for that funding. So, you know, going to the priority panel right now, which is what we're talking about here, is going to get that approval for where you're going to list is pretty much, we're doing it now because We're going to continue to do that after we get past the
So
bipartisan.
you're confident that that's going to happen?
We're going to get the
That's-
funding. The funding is going to be available for it
So
now.
if there's $3.5 billion nationwide on this, and getting back to Josh's point earlier, that the EPA or the federal government will be responsible for 2 years,
Yep.
$4 million. And you thought it would cost 30 years possibly for this, at $4 million, that's $120 million. Am I correct, that arithmetic?
Yeah, I mean, you do- you
$120
adjust
million
for-
on that, and you have $3.5 billion for this? And this one site alone, you think could cost the taxpayers of Pennsylvania $120 million?
Over 30 years, I mean, and that, we assume 30 years just because we think it will take at least that long. So you kind of, that's where you cap out. Yeah,
I thank you all very much for your time.
sure.
So I would just say one thing to add on to kind of what Josh was saying a little while ago is that, if you've been in this business of cleaning up Superfund sites for as long as I have, over 30 years, the technologies have changed and grown in that 30 years amazingly. The thermal technologies, the bioremediation technologies he was alluding to, there's others that have evolved over time. And I would say that if someone like me who's working at EPA now ends up in that spot 30 years from now, there'll be other technologies that are around that could potentially be implemented that would reduce the time and the cost to clean up sites. I don't know if that's going to actually happen, but it sure has happened over the last 30 years. So I would assume that that would probably occur as well. We can only plan for what we know. And, one of the reasons why we're back here is because we made decisions over the years based on what we knew at that time, and it was our best professional judgment on how we thought best to clean it up. Turns out we were not completely right? When you're poking little tiny pinholes in the ground, in a site that covers, as big of an area as it is now, those wells are, it's like in this room, if you were putting straw on the floor, that's the amount of information you're getting, right? And you got to try to project what you think you're finding in those little straw pinholes all around for long-term cleanup. So we have to be able to adjust. And that's why we have to keep learning as we go. And, I think the biggest, most important part of this remedy is the additional delineation of the deep aquifer. Until we know what the boundaries are in all of this, we won't know for sure what that long-term cleanup is actually going to look like. But I think it's really important to do this part and that groundwater investigation to delineate the boundaries, and then we'll have a better idea, a better chance of figuring out how long it's going to take and what ways we can go about doing that.
I'm fine now. My watch did this in the middle of the night the other night. It scared the bejesus out of me. I woke up, my watch is telling me I have an elevated heart rate. And I'm like, what's going on here? So I'm not sure if I trust this thing. We'll see. I'm okay. I feel fine. Maybe I was wearing my CPAP. I don't know. Anyway, so are there any other questions, comments, anything of note?
I just wanted to be clear.
Yeah.
I'm new to this area.
Can you come up to the microphone?
Yeah, sure, it's a short question.
Sorry.
Just the amount of money that we'd be going for EPA funding, is that the 20 million, or is that just the initial operating cost? This will fund the construction, and then it's the operating cost that gets moved over to Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the funding we're requesting is to build the new treatment facility and to run it for an estimated 24 months. That's out of the federal government appropriations. The temporary treatment facility will keep running during that whole time. That's already fully funded. That's set to run for several years if need be under the removal program. And then when it comes to DEP, that's an obligation from the Commonwealth that they would be ready to take over when it's time. There's a whole administrative process where we have to document. Do you agree that the treatment plant is working the way it's supposed to? Yes, I think we both agree. All right, here's the date of the exchange. Does that answer your question?
I think so. And to what extent is the Pennsylvania contract going to, is Pennsylvania involved in any of this approval, or are they just picking it up, whatever the EPA has decided at this juncture, and it's just going to be handed off and they get it no matter what?
So in this situation, So it's not an all EPA and then, hey, DEP, here you go. And my counterpart from DEP is right there, so he can speak on this as well. So we would be fully funding, typically there for a cleanup like this or under a non-time critical removal action, there's a 10% cost share by DEP, but using the infrastructure funding, that 10% cost share is waived. So we are taking on 100% of the costs now, but the agreement that we have with DEP is existing, but we're developing a new one for these new costs. We need to document, so when we did the old contract, the old Superfund state contract, there was a set of assumptions and things that were known and costs that were estimated at the time. As those things have changed, we need to update that contract so that we're all on the same page with regards to the financial obligations, and the EPA and DEP have to sign off on that. And Colin, I don't know if you want to say anything else to that or not, or if I got it.
Sure. So DEP does operations and maintenance at, old Superfund sites all throughout the Commonwealth. That funding comes from the Hazard Sites Cleanup Fund, which is replenished right now primarily from the impact fee from gas drilling, as well as lawsuits against responsible parties, where DEP is doing the cleanup at sites. Okay. That doesn't come from, general fund, sales tax, income tax.
Sure.
It's a special fund.
Okay.
That's a good point. Thank you. Anything else?
Just one question, and again, I'm such a neophyte at this. Our highest concentration is in a corner of the testing zone. And are we getting the cooperation that's needed on the western edge of that site?
Oh, you mean from like a property owner
Are we
access
getting-
standpoint?
Right.
Yeah, thus far, yes. The owner that is, all of the owners that are on or around the site have been very cooperative over the years. There was documentation provided by EPA before they bought the sites before they bought those parcels, and then they're considered bona fide prospective purchasers, which means they have certain liability, the expectation of lack of liability for certain things generally, as long as they're cooperative. They've always been cooperative. We work with the township, and they've also always been cooperative and greatly helpful, actually. I mean, they're letting us use this tonight. So thus far, we've never had a challenge with getting access where we wanted to go or where we needed to go.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Yep. All right. We're 3 minutes ahead of schedule. You get 3 minutes back. I want to thank everybody for your time, for letting me drone on as long as I did. It's a lot to cover, and we can do this as often as we need to update the community. But I really want to thank everybody for their time, their thoughtfulness, the efforts that go into all of the site work and the planning that's going to be happening going forward. So thank you. That's all that I have to say for the night, and I hope everybody has a safe trip home. Enjoy I guess it's not so warm out anymore, but it was. Oh, yes, I'm sorry, yeah, so thank you for the applause. I wanted to put up here my contact information, Bob's and Angela's. The Superfund site website has all the information, including the link to the ECA, the administrative record. My EPA cell phone is there. Text me anytime. That's the best way to get a hold of me, call or text. Anything regarding the site or anything that comes up regarding the EPA work, we want to know.
This PowerPoint's available?
Yes, it will be tomorrow morning.
Or some point I will get that up there. And if you just generally Google Havertown PCP Superfund site, the site will come up. That's close to trying to type all that.
Yeah, sorry.
And I can do better.
Thanks. Thank you.